the unforgiving dust of the American West, a man's worth was measured by his grit, his aim, and the land he held. For Caleb Thorne, all three were about to be stripped away. His father's last breath was a bargain with the devil, a deal to save their family ranch that came with an unthinkable price, Caleb's hand in marriage. He was bound not to a sweetheart from a neighboring homestead, but to a total stranger, a woman whose immense size was the talk of the territory and the source of his deepest shame. He saw her as a burden, a living monument to his failure. What he couldn't see was the truth hidden behind her eyes, a secret that would either save his world or shatter it completely. This is the story of that forced vow and the astonishing truth that no one saw coming. The air in the small room was thick with the scent of pine polish and impending death. Caleb Thorne stood by the window, his gaze fixed on the endless stretch of Montana prairie beyond Thorn Creek Ranch, but he saw none of it. All he saw was the reflection of a trapped man. His father, Elias Thorne, lay in the bed behind him, his breaths a shallow, ragged whisper against the horsehair pillow. The doctor from Redemption Gulch had left an hour ago, his face a mask of grim finality. There was nothing more to be done. For 3 years they had fought. They'd fought the drought that turned their pastures to cracked earth, the blight that withered their meager crops, and the creeping reach of Silas Blackwood, a man who collected land and power with the same cold reptilian hunger. Blackwood owned the bank, the freight company, and half the souls in Redemption Gulch. Now it seemed he was coming for what was left of theirs. Caleb Elias rasped his voice, a dry rustle of leaves. Caleb turned his own face, a hard mask of grief and exhaustion. He was a tall man, built lean and strong from a life of hard labor, with sun-bleached hair and eyes the color of a stormy sky. He knelt by the bedside. "I'm here, Pa. The ranch." Elias coughed a wet rattling sound that shook his frail body. I couldn't lose it. Not Thorn Creek. "We won't," Caleb said the words, tasting like a lie. He knew the foreclosure notices were already drawn up. Blackwood was just waiting for Elias to pass before swooping in like a vulture. "I made a deal," his father confessed, his eyes pleading for an understanding Caleb couldn't possibly give. "With Blackwood." A cold dread coiled in Caleb's gut. "What kind of deal?" He forgives the debt. All of it. The ranch is yours. Free and clear." Elias's voice was barely audible. "But there's a condition. A contract." Caleb waited the silence, stretching into an eternity. Deals with Silas Blackwood were never clean. They always came with a hidden hook, a barb that dug deep and festered. "He has a daughter," Elias whispered. "Abigail." Caleb knew of her. Everyone did. Abigail Blackwood was a local legend, and not for any good reason. She was spoken of in hushed tones, a recluse rarely seen outside the imposing Blackwood manor. The whispers always focused on one thing her size. Larger than a draft horse, one ranch hand had snickered at the saloon. Could block the sun. Another had joked cruelly. She was Silas Blackwood's monstrous, unmarriable daughter. "He wants her to have a name, a husband," Elias continued his words, tumbling out in a rush. "He wants you to marry her." The world tilted on its axis. Caleb stared at his dying father, a mix of horror and disbelief warring on his face. "Marry her, marry Abigail Blackwood. Pa, have you lost your mind?" "It's the only way," son Elias pleaded, a tear tracing a path through the dust on his cheek. "The land. Your grandfather built this place from nothing. I swore on my wife's grave I'd never let it go." Caleb stood up, pacing the small room like a caged wolf. "So you'd sell me, you'd chain me to that woman for a piece of dirt." The words were harsher than he intended, but his pride, his very sense of self was under assault. He was Caleb Thorne, respected capable. Men looked up to him. Women looked at him. The thought of standing at an altar with Abigail Blackwood, of enduring the smirks and pitying glances of the entire town, was a humiliation beyond measure. It's not just dirt, Caleb. It's our home. Our legacy, his father cried weakly. Please, for me. Caleb looked at the man who had taught him to ride to rope, to read the land and the sky. He saw the desperation in his eyes, the terror of dying a failure. And in that moment, Caleb's future withered and died. He was trapped between a promise to the dying and a life sentence with a stranger he already despised. Fine, he bit out the word, tasting like ash. I'll do it. Relief washed over Elias Thorne's face, so profound it seemed to steal the last of his strength. He closed his eyes. Thank you, son. He didn't speak again. 2 hours later, as the sun bled across the horizon, he was gone. The wedding, if one could call it that, was held 3 days later in the sterile office of Judge Peterson. It was a miserable grey affair. Caleb wore his only good suit, which felt like a shroud. He stood stiffly, his jaw clenched so tight his teeth ached. Silas Blackwood was there, a mountain of a man in a fine wool coat, his face impassive, but his eyes glinting with a possessive triumph. He looked at Caleb, not as a son-in-law, but as a newly acquired asset. And then she entered. The whispers hadn't been exaggerations. Abigail Blackwood was a woman of astonishing size. She was swathed in a dark green dress of heavy fabric that did nothing to conceal her bulk. Her face was round with a small down-turned mouth and eyes that were fixed firmly on the floorboards. Her brown hair was pulled back in a severe bun, revealing the pale, puffy skin of her cheeks. She moved with a slow, heavy grace that seemed an apology for the space she occupied. Caleb felt a fresh wave of revulsion, and to his shame, a flicker of pity. She looked as miserable as he felt. She didn't look like a monster. She looked like a lonely, frightened girl, trapped in the body of a giantess. Judge Peterson mumbled the words of the ceremony, his voice droning on devoid of any warmth. When it came time for the vows, Caleb's voice was a low, dead thing. Abigail's was even quieter, a fragile whisper that was nearly lost in the room. He forced himself to take her hand, to place the simple iron ring he'd been given. Her hand was soft and fleshy and surprisingly cool. He dropped it as soon as he could. When the judge declared them man and wife, there was no kiss. The notion was so repellent to Caleb that he physically recoiled. He saw a flicker of hurt in her eyes before she quickly looked away, her face flushing a deep, mottled red. Silas Blackwood clapped him on the shoulder, a gesture of ownership. Well done, son. The debt is cleared. The deed to Thorn Creek is in your name. All you have to do is be a husband to my Abigail. He leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a menacing purr. You will treat her with respect. She is a Blackwood. If I hear otherwise, well, contracts can be unmade as easily as they are made. The threat was clear. Caleb wasn't just a husband, he was a custodian. The ride back to the ranch was a study in agonizing silence. Caleb drove the buckboard, his eyes locked on the horizon. Abigail sat beside him, a vast and silent presence, her hands folded tightly in her lap. The dust from the horse's hooves coated her dark dress, and she seemed to shrink with every mile, drawing into herself, until she was nothing but a mountain of miserable fabric. When they finally arrived at the small, weathered ranch house, it felt less like a home and more like a prison for two. Caleb reined in the horses and jumped down without a word. He began unhitching them, his movements brisk and angry. Abigail remained on the buckboard looking at the house. It was a simple, sturdy structure of timber and stone with a porch that sagged slightly and windows that looked like tired eyes. It was a world away from the opulent, suffocating manor she had left behind. After a long moment, she gathered her skirts and began the awkward, difficult process of climbing down from the high seat. Caleb finished with the horses turned and saw her struggling. A part of him, the decent man his father had raised, wanted to help. But the bitter, humiliated part of him won out. He turned his back and walked toward the barn, leaving his new wife to fend for herself in the dusty yard of their new life. The sun was setting, casting long, lonely shadows that stretched between them like an impassable chasm. The first weeks of their marriage were defined by a silence as vast and profound as the Montana sky. Caleb moved through his days with a grim, single-minded focus. He rose before dawn, his boots thudding on the floorboards, a deliberate, angry rhythm. He'd drink black coffee, standing by the stove, and be out the door before Abigail had even stirred. He threw himself into the work of the ranch with a ferocity born of desperation, mending fences that didn't need mending, clearing brush that could have waited riding the perimeter of his land, as if patrolling the walls of his own jail cell. The physical exhaustion was a welcome anesthetic, numbing the constant simmering resentment in his gut. He was a husband in name only. He had moved his things into the small secondary bedroom, the one his mother had used for sewing on their first night. He'd done it without a word, simply gathering his bedroll and a change of clothes from the main room and shutting the door behind him. He didn't know if Abigail was relieved or hurt, and he told himself he didn't care. The house had 2 rooms, a small kitchen and a living space. It was far too small to contain the enormity of their mutual discomfort. They were like 2 celestial bodies, trapped in the wrong orbit, constantly aware of each other's presence, their gravitational fields repelling one another. Abigail, for her part, tried to inhabit the space he had abandoned. She moved with a quiet, deliberate slowness that initially grated on Caleb's nerves. In the rare moments he was inside during daylight hours, he would watch her from the corner of his eye. He saw the way she had to carefully navigate the narrow doorways, the way she held her hands clasped in front of her, as if to physically restrain herself from taking up too much room. She was, to his surprise, a tireless worker. The house, which had fallen into a state of bachelor disarray after his mother's passing years ago and his father's recent illness, began to change. Dust vanished from surfaces. The windows were washed until they gleamed, letting in the stark western light. The scent of lye soap and baking bread began to replace the stale odors of dust and sorrow. She mended his torn shirts, her stitches small and neat, and laid them on his bed without a word. She cooked. Every evening, Caleb would return from the fields caked in dirt and sweat to find a hot meal waiting on the table. It was simple, hearty fare: stew, roasted potatoes, thick slices of freshly baked bread. But it was delicious. He would eat in sullen silence, shoveling the food into his mouth without looking at her. He refused to give her the satisfaction of a compliment. He would eat, push his plate back, and retreat to his room or the porch, leaving her to clear the table alone in the flickering lamplight. One evening, he came in to find a plate of molasses cookies cooling on the counter. His mother used to make them. The scent hit him with the force of a physical blow, a sudden sharp pang of nostalgia and grief that momentarily broke through his wall of anger. He almost said something, almost thanked her, but the words caught in his throat. Acknowledging her kindness felt like a surrender. He simply took a cookie, its warmth spreading through his hand, and walked out onto the porch, chewing on it, and the bitterness in his heart. Abigail's days were a lonely ritual. She learned the geography of the small house, the creak of each floorboard, the way the morning sun hit the kitchen table. She read the few books left on the shelf, a well-thumbed Bible, a book on animal husbandry, and a collection of Shakespearean plays. At night, she would lie in the large bed they were meant to share the empty space beside her, a cold and silent accusation. She would listen to Caleb's movements in the next room, the sigh of the mattress as he sat down, the soft thud of his boots hitting the floor. Sometimes in the dead of night, she thought she could hear him sigh a sound so laden with despair it mirrored the ache in her own chest. Her father had warned her. "He won't want you," Silas had said, his voice stripped of all pretense. "He wants the land. Your duty is to be quiet, be useful, and not give him any reason to send you back. Do you understand?" She had understood perfectly. Her entire life had been a lesson in being unseen, unheard, and unwanted. Her mother had died in childbirth, and Abigail often felt that her father had never forgiven her for the dual crime of existing and not being a son. He fed her, clothed her, and sheltered her, but he did so with the detached air of a man maintaining a piece of property he found distasteful. Her size had been a source of shame since childhood. Doctors had been consulted, diets had been enforced, but nothing changed. She simply grew outward and upward until she became the creature of whispers and cruel jokes. She had retreated into a world of books and solitude, her mind her only sanctuary. A month into the silent standoff, a late-season storm rolled in. The sky turned a bruised purple, and a cold, driving rain lashed against the house. Caleb was forced inside, trapped. He sat at the table sharpening a knife with long, angry strokes of the whetstone, the rhythmic shing, 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 filling the tense silence. Abigail sat in a chair by the hearth, her hands busy with some mending. The fire crackled, casting dancing shadows on the walls. For an hour, the only sounds were the knife, the fire, and the storm. Finally, seeking any escape from the suffocating quiet, Caleb's eyes landed on a small, locked wooden box on the mantelpiece. It had been his father's. It held old deeds, letters, and memories. He had not had the heart to open it since Elias's death. Abigail's gaze followed his. "Your father's?" she asked, her voice soft, tentative. It was the first time one of them had initiated a conversation about anything other than a request to pass the salt. Caleb grunted in affirmation, not taking his eyes off the box. "My mother left a box like that," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "My father keeps it in his study. He never let me see what was inside." The unexpected sliver of shared experience was unsettling. Caleb stopped sharpening to the knife. He looked at her truly, looked at her for the first time in weeks. In the warm firelight, the harsh lines of his judgment softened. He saw the loneliness in her downcast eyes, the quiet intelligence that seemed to lurk beneath the surface. She wasn't just a physical presence. She was a person as trapped in this situation as he was. "The key is in his old coat," Caleb said, his own voice sounding rough and unused. He stood, walked to the hook by the door and retrieved the heavy wool coat. He fumbled in the pocket and pulled out a small, ornate iron key. He returned to the mantel, the key heavy in his palm. He felt Abigail's eyes on him, curious and patient. The storm raged outside, mirroring the turmoil within him. He stood before the box, hesitating. Opening it felt like opening a door to the past, a past that had led him to this very moment, to this very room with this very woman, and for the first time, he wondered if the answers he needed weren't out on the plains he worked so hard to tame, but right here, inside these four walls, locked away in silence. The decision to open the box hung in the air between them. Caleb held the key, the cold iron a stark contrast to the warmth of the fire. He was a man who solved problems with his hands, with strength and sweat. The intricate, painful puzzle his father had left him was a different kind of challenge, one that required a stillness he wasn't accustomed to. Finally, with a deep breath that felt like surrendering a piece of his anger, he inserted the key into the lock. It turned with a rusty click. He lifted the lid, revealing a jumble of yellowed papers, a tarnished silver locket, and underneath it all a thick, leather-bound ledger. It was the ranch's account book, stretching back years. He set the ledger on the table, the scent of old paper and dry ink filling the space. Abigail, seeing his hesitation, rose slowly from her chair and approached the table. She didn't crowd him, but stood at a respectful distance, her shadow long in the firelight. "May I?" she asked, her voice quiet. Caleb pushed the book toward her. He didn't know why. Perhaps it was curiosity to see what she would do. Perhaps it was a desire to share the burden even with her. He opened it to the last few pages, which were filled with his father's increasingly shaky handwriting. The entries chronicled the ranch's slow bleed, dwindling profits from cattle sales, the rising cost of feed, and finally, a series of large, desperate loans from the Blackwood Bank. Caleb's finger traced the final damning entry. A loan for $500, an astronomical sum secured against the deed of the ranch itself. He was a proud man, Caleb said, his voice thick. He must have been desperate. Abigail didn't respond immediately. She pulled a chair over and sat her large frame settling with a soft sigh. She gently took the ledger, her movements careful, almost reverent. She didn't look at the last pages. Instead, she turned back to the beginning, to the years when Thorn Creek was profitable, when the ink was confident and the numbers were black. For the next hour she was silent, utterly absorbed. Her finger, surprisingly nimble, traced the columns of figures, her brow furrowed in concentration. Caleb watched her, a strange feeling creeping over him. He had dismissed her as a simple, bovine creature. But the woman before him was anything but. There was an intensity in her gaze, a deep focus that bespoke a quick and active mind. She wasn't just reading the numbers. She was interpreting them, seeing a story he had missed. "This is wrong," she said suddenly, her voice firm. Caleb leaned forward. "What's wrong?" "The interest," she said, tapping a page from 2 years ago. "The first loan your father took from the bank. The rate was set at 6%, standard for a secured loan back then. But here," she turned a few pages, "on the second loan the rate jumped to 12%, and on the last one it was 20%. No legitimate bank would charge that. It's usury." Caleb stared at the figures. He knew his father had been paying a high price, but he hadn't understood the mechanics of it. To him it was just debt, a suffocating weight. To Abigail it was a pattern, a calculated trap. He was strangling him. Caleb whispered, the realization dawning. Blackwood wasn't helping him stay afloat. He was deliberately sinking him. He was creating a debt so large it could never be repaid with money. Abigail agreed, her eyes meeting his. For the first time, there was no fear or shame in her gaze, only a shared, simmering anger. He wanted a debt that could only be paid one way. With the land, Caleb finished. Or with me. The storm outside had lessened to a steady drizzle. Inside, the atmosphere had shifted. The wall of silence had been breached, replaced by a fragile, tentative alliance. For the first time since their wedding, they were not just a man and a woman in a room. They were two people with a common enemy. Over the next few days, a new routine established itself. After Caleb finished his work outside, he would come in, and they would sit at the table with the ledger. Abigail's mind, so long kept under wraps, was a formidable instrument. She had spent years of lonely silence in her father's house, and her one secret comfort had been his library, which was filled with books on finance law and economics. Silas Blackwood, in his arrogance, had never imagined his unwanted daughter was absorbing the very knowledge he used to build his empire. She explained things to Caleb in a clear, patient way. She showed him how the freight costs for his cattle shipped via Blackwood's company were inflated. She pointed out how the prices he received at the Blackwood-controlled market were consistently lower than fair value. It was a web of deceit so intricate and subtle that Elias Thorne, a simple rancher, had never stood a chance. "He's been stealing from your family for years," she concluded one evening, her voice filled with a quiet fury. The loans were just the final nail in the coffin. As Caleb began to see the depth of the deception, his view of Abigail continued to transform. He started to see past her physical form. He saw the intelligence that sparked in her eyes, the determination in the set of her jaw. He started to notice small things, the way she smiled faintly when one of the barn cats rubbed against her leg, the gentleness with which she tended the small herb garden she had planted by the back door. He was beginning to see the woman, not the burden. One afternoon, their fragile peace was shattered by the arrival of a rider. It was Nash Silas Blackwood's foreman. Nash was a lean, wiry man, with cold, dead eyes and a cruel twist to his mouth. He was Blackwood's enforcer, the physical threat behind the financial one. He dismounted without being invited, his spurs jingling with menace as he strode onto the porch where Caleb was repairing a harness. "Blackwood sent me," Nash said, his voice a gravelly drawl. He didn't look at Caleb, but peered through the open door into the house where he could see Abigail putting away the ledger. "Wants to know his daughter is being well cared for." "She's fine," Caleb said, his hand tightening on the harness. Nash's eyes narrowed. "Heard you two are spending a lot of time indoors, getting cozy, looking at old books." The message was clear. They were being watched. "My wife is helping me with my accounts," Caleb said, his voice level, though his heart was pounding. "It's no concern of your boss." Nash took a step closer, invading Caleb's space. "Everything on this land is his concern. Don't you forget it, Thorne. He gave you this ranch. He can take it away just as easy. And he can take her, too." He spat a stream of tobacco juice that landed inches from Caleb's boot. "You just make sure you're a good husband, keep her happy, and quiet." With a final insolent look, Nash turned, swung onto his horse, and rode away, leaving a trail of dust and unspoken threats. Caleb stood frozen for a moment, a cold fury rising in him. He walked back into the house. Abigail was standing by the table, her face pale, her hands trembling slightly. "He knows," she whispered. "He knows we're looking into it." "Let him know." Caleb said, his voice harder than she'd ever heard it. He walked to the mantel and picked up the contract his father had signed, the marriage contract. He had barely been able to look at it before. Now he read it with new eyes, scanning the dense legal text. Abigail came to stand beside him, her presence no longer awkward, but reassuring. She pointed to a clause near the end, a long, convoluted paragraph filled with legal jargon. "There," she said. "I read it the night before the wedding. I didn't understand it then, but I think I do now." Caleb squinted, trying to parse the language. It spoke of spousal duty, maintenance of the estate, and fiscal prudence. It seemed like standard boilerplate. "What does it mean?" he asked. Abigail's voice was grim. "It means my father didn't just forgive the debt, he transferred it. The contract states that if the ranch fails to turn a profit within the first year of our marriage, or if the husband is deemed fiscally irresponsible, the ownership of the property reverts not to the bank, but to the bride's guardian, my father, as settlement for her dowry and upkeep." The air went out of Caleb's lungs. It was the ultimate trap. He hadn't been saved. He had been placed in a cage with a 1-year timer. Blackwood had no intention of letting him succeed. He would use his control of the markets and freight to ensure the ranch failed, and then he would legally take it, using Caleb's own failure as the justification. The marriage wasn't the price, it was the mechanism of the theft. Caleb looked from the contract to Abigail, whose face was a mixture of fear and resolve. He finally understood. Silas Blackwood hadn't just married her off to get rid of her. He had used her, his own daughter, as the final perfect piece in his long and patient game to steal Thorn Creek. And she was the only one who had been smart enough to figure it out. The discovery of the contract's hidden clause changed everything. The quiet ranch house, once a prison of resentment, was now a war room. The shared enemy Silas Blackwood had forged a bond between Caleb and Abigail that was stronger than any vow spoken before a judge. The fight was no longer just for the land. It was a fight for their dignity, for a future free from the shadow of Abigail's father. Caleb's respect for his wife grew with each passing day. He saw how her mind worked, piecing together fragments of information, anticipating Blackwood's moves. They spent their evenings poring over the old papers from his father's box, searching for anything that might give them an edge. It was during one of these sessions that they found a bundle of letters tied with a faded ribbon. They were from Caleb's mother to her sister, written over 20 years ago. Most were filled with the simple news of ranch life, but one letter made Caleb pause. His mother wrote of a partnership Elias had entered into during a particularly harsh winter. A man from back east, full of ambition and coin, had proposed they go in together on a new mining claim up in the Granite Peaks. The man's name was Silas Blackwood. They were partners, Caleb said, disbelief coloring his tone. Pa never mentioned that. Perhaps it didn't end well. Abigail suggested, her eyes scanning the delicate script. The next letter confirmed her suspicion. Caleb's mother wrote in a distressed hand about the partnership souring. Blackwood, she wrote, was a man who saw laws as suggestions and men as tools. There had been an accident at the claim, a small cave-in. A third partner, a local prospector named Marcus Webb, had been killed. Blackwood had handled the official report, claiming it was a tragic misfortune. But Elias, his mother wrote, was haunted by it. He believed Blackwood had deliberately neglected a support beam to save money, directly causing Webb's death. Elias had wanted to go to the sheriff, but Blackwood had threatened him, reminding him that as a partner, he was just as legally culpable. The partnership was dissolved, the failed claim was abandoned, and Elias Thorne carried the secret and the guilt for the rest of his life. The final piece of the puzzle clicked into place. This wasn't just about land, this was a vendetta. Blackwood's relentless pursuit of Thorn Creek was about silencing the last man who knew the truth of his past. The debt was his weapon, and the marriage was his final cruel twist of the knife, a way to dominate the son of the man he could never fully break. "He's a murderer," Caleb said, the words falling like stones in the quiet room. He looked at Abigail, whose face was pale. He saw her not as the daughter of a killer, but as another of his victims. The knowledge galvanized them, but it also raised the stakes to a terrifying new level. They weren't just fighting a crooked businessman. They were fighting a man who would kill to protect his secrets. Blackwood, sensing their resistance, tightened his grip. The price for feed at the general store suddenly doubled, but only for Caleb. When he tried to sell a few head of cattle to cover the cost, the buyer at the stockyard, a man on Blackwood's payroll, offered him a price so insultingly low it was laughable. The web was closing in just as the contract was designed for it to do. The psychological warfare soon escalated to a physical one. One night they were awoken by the frantic whinnying of horses. Caleb grabbed his rifle and rushed out to the barn. The doors had been thrown open, and his two best horses were gone. He spent the entire next day tracking them, finally finding them miles away, exhausted and spooked. A week later, it was the northern fence line. Someone had cut the wires in a dozen places, allowing a portion of his herd to wander onto a neighboring property, forcing a tense and difficult negotiation to retrieve them. The hand of Nash Blackwood's foreman was behind it all. Though they never saw him, they felt his presence, a malevolent ghost, intent on breaking their spirit. The breaking point came on a moonless night. A strange orange glow flickered against their bedroom window. Caleb was out of bed in an instant. Fire. The hay shed, situated a dangerous 50 yards from the main house, was engulfed in flames. The dry timber and packed hay burned with terrifying speed, sending a column of sparks and smoke into the night sky. It held their entire winter feed for the cattle. Without it, the herd would starve. Caleb grabbed a bucket, his mind racing. It was hopeless. The shed was a lost cause. His only thought was to keep the fire from spreading to the house or the barn. "Abigail, stay in the house," he yelled, running toward the well. But she didn't listen. When he turned back, bucket sloshing with water, she was there, a heavy horse blanket, soaked with water in her hands. Her face was smudged with soot, her eyes wide, not with fear, but with fierce determination. The fire illuminated her, and in that moment, Caleb saw no hint of the timid, shamed woman from their wedding day. He saw a warrior. "The wind is shifting," she shouted over the roar of the flames. "It's going to catch the barn." Together they fought the blaze. Caleb doused the walls of the barn, while Abigail used the heavy wet blanket to beat out the embers and creeping lines of fire that threatened to cross the yard. It was grueling, hellish work. The heat was immense, the smoke thick and choking. Caleb's arms ached, his lungs burned. He glanced over at Abigail, who was working with a strength he never could have imagined. Her size, which had once been the object of his scorn, was now an asset. She swung the heavy blanket with a power that matched his own, her face set in a grim mask of resolve. They fought for what felt like an eternity, two desperate figures against a roaring inferno. Finally, as the shed collapsed into a heap of glowing embers, they succeeded in containing the fire. The barn was safe. The house was safe. They stood in the yard, gasping for breath, covered in soot and grime. The smell of smoke and defeat hung heavy in the air. Their winter feed was gone. Financially, they were ruined, according to the terms of the contract Blackwood had won. Caleb sank to his knees, the full weight of their failure crashing down on him. "It's over," he choked out, slamming a fist into the dirt. "He's won." Abigail came and stood over him. He expected to hear despair in her voice, but instead it was clear and steady. "No," she said. "He's only won if we let him believe he has." Caleb looked up at her, his vision blurred by sweat and smoke. "What are you talking about? We're broke. The ranch will fail. The contract is based on finance," she said, her mind already working, cutting through the haze of their disaster. "But what he's done tonight, this isn't finance. This is a crime. And the story of his partnership with your father, that's not in any ledger. His greatest weakness isn't in his numbers, it's in his reputation." Caleb slowly got to his feet. He looked at the smoldering ruins of the shed, then at the woman standing before him. She was right. They had been trying to fight Silas Blackwood on his terms in a game he had rigged. It was time to change the game. Marcus Webb. Caleb said the name, feeling solid and real on his tongue. The prospector who died. His family must still be around. And the other ranchers, Abigail added, her eyes gleaming with a strategic light. The ones he's been bleeding dry for years. They're afraid of him, but they hate him more. A man alone is weak Caleb. But a town united. A new hope, fragile but fierce, began to dawn in Caleb's chest. He looked at Abigail, at her soot-stained face, and the unwavering strength in her eyes. The fire had destroyed their assets, but it had forged them into an unbreakable team. He had been forced to marry a stranger, a woman he thought would be his ruin. He now knew she was his only salvation. "All right," he said, a slow, determined smile spreading across his face. "Let's go to town, but we're not going to see the banker. We're going to see everyone else." He reached out and for the first time took her hand. It was soft and strong, and it fit perfectly in his. The next morning, Caleb and Abigail rode into Redemption Gulch, not as defeated ranchers, but as bearers of a truth long buried. They didn't ride a fine carriage. They rode on the back of the sturdy buckboard, side by side, united. Caleb's face was set with a grim resolve, while Abigail, dressed in a simple but clean dark blue dress, held a quiet confidence that seemed to radiate from her. The townsfolk who saw them pass paused and stared. The sight of Caleb Thorne and his large, reclusive wife presenting such a united front was a curiosity in itself. Their first stop was not the sheriff's office or the bank. It was a small, dusty homestead on the edge of town, home to Martha Webb, the elderly widow of the prospector Marcus Webb. They found her in her garden, a frail woman with eyes that still held a deep, unhealed sorrow. Caleb introduced himself and Abigail, his voice gentle. "Ma'am," he began, "we need to talk to you about your husband and about Silas Blackwood." The woman's face hardened at the name. She invited them inside to a small, clean room filled with faded photographs. For the next hour they listened as she spoke of her husband, a good and honest man, obsessed with finding his fortune. She recounted the partnership with Thorne and Blackwood, and the day the news came of the accident. She had never believed the official story. "Marcus was the most careful man I ever knew," she said, her voice trembling with ancient grief. "He knew those mountains like the back of his hand. He said that Blackwood fellow cut corners that he cared more for coin than for men's lives. But we had no proof. No one would listen to a poor widow against a rich man like him." Abigail then spoke, her voice full of a compassion that immediately earned the old woman's trust. She didn't make accusations. She simply asked questions. "Did your husband keep a journal, Mrs. Webb? Any letters?" The widow's eyes lit with a flicker of memory. She went to an old sea chest in the corner, and after a moment of rummaging, pulled out a small, leather-bound diary. "He wrote in it every night," she said, handing it to Caleb. They spent another hour there with Caleb, reading Marcus Webb's clear, concise entries aloud. The last week of his life was documented in stark detail. His growing concerns about a cracked support beam, his arguments with Blackwood over the cost of replacing it, and his final entry, written the night before, "He died. Blackwood refuses to halt the work. Says we can't afford the delay. I fear he is valuing gold over our very lives. I will not enter the shaft tomorrow without Elias by my side. He is a good man. He will see reason." It was the proof they needed. Elias hadn't been there when the cave-in happened. Blackwood had likely sent him on a fool's errand, leaving Marcus alone and vulnerable. Their next stop was the office of the Redemption Gulch Clarion, the local newspaper. The editor, a man named Phineas Cole, was a harried-looking man with ink stains on his fingers, known for his fear of Blackwood's advertising money. Caleb laid the journal on his desk. "This is the story of how Marcus Webb really died," he said, "and we have the letter from my mother corroborating my father's fears. This is the truth." Cole looked from the journal to Abigail, his eyes wide. "This is Dynamite Thorne. Blackwood will ruin me." "He's already ruining this town," Abigail said, her voice commanding the room. "He's been systematically bankrupting ranchers for years. My husband is just the latest victim." She then produced the Thorn Creek ledger, opening it to the pages detailing the predatory loans. "He uses his own bank to create fraudulent debt. He uses his freight company to strangle supply lines. We have his contract. We can prove that he designed our marriage as a tool to steal my husband's land." She explained the scheme, her financial literacy dazzling the newspaperman. She laid out the whole conspiracy, from the usurious interest rates to the hidden clause in the marriage contract. It was a story of greed so monstrous and intricate that Cole could not look away. "The people of this valley deserve to know who Silas Blackwood really is," Caleb finished. "He's not a pillar of the community. He's a parasite, and he's been feeding on all of us for 20 years. Their final stop was the saloon. It was mid-afternoon, and a handful of ranchers and townsfolk were nursing beers, their faces etched with the worry of men barely holding on. Caleb walked to the center of the room, Abigail a step behind him. The place went quiet. "I have something to say." Caleb announced, his voice ringing with authority. He told them everything. He told them about his father's partnership with Blackwood, about the death of Marcus Webb, and the guilt that haunted him. He told them about the loans, the inflated freight costs, the fixed cattle prices. He held up his own marriage contract. "He forced me to marry his daughter, not out of concern for her, but to use her as the final piece in his plan to steal my land." A murmur went through the crowd. Many of these men had their own stories of ruinous dealings with Blackwood. "He's picking us off one by one," Caleb continued, his voice rising with passion. "He counts on us being too scared, too isolated to fight back. He burned my hay shed 2 nights ago to seal my fate. But he made a mistake. He showed his hand. He showed me that we can't fight him alone." It was then that Silas Blackwood himself appeared in the doorway, flanked by his foreman, Nash. He had clearly been summoned by one of his spies. "What is the meaning of this circus?" Blackwood boomed, his face a thundercloud of fury, his eyes fixed on Abigail. "Daughter, you will come with me now. You have disgraced our name." Abigail did not flinch. She stepped forward, standing beside Caleb, facing her father. "The only disgrace to our name is you, father," she said, her voice clear and strong, resonating through the stunned silence of the saloon. "I have spent my life in your shadow, silent and ashamed, but I will be silent no more. You are a thief and a killer." "Lies," Blackwood roared. "Slander from a desperate man and his pathetic half-witted wife." "Is it a lie?" Caleb challenged, holding up Marcus Webb's journal. "Or is the truth written right here in the dead man's own hand?" Just then, the doors swung open again. Sheriff Brody, a man who had long been criticized for his deference to Blackwood, walked in. But he wasn't alone. With him were Phineas Cole from the newspaper and a dozen other ranchers, their faces grim and determined. The tide was turning. "Silas Blackwood." The sheriff said, his voice surprisingly firm. "I think you and I need to have a talk about the death of Marcus Webb, and about criminal arson. And fraud." Blackwood looked around the room at the sea of hard, accusing faces. For the first time, Caleb saw a flicker of fear in the man's eyes. His power had always been built on the illusion of invincibility and the reality of his victim's isolation. Now the walls were down. The town was united against him. Nash, seeing his employer's power crumble, made a desperate move. His hand went for his gun, but he never cleared the holster. Caleb, anticipating the move, launched himself forward, tackling the foreman in a shower of splintered wood and overturned chairs. The two men wrestled on the floor, a flurry of fists and grunts. The other ranchers surged forward, surrounding them, ensuring it was a fair fight. Caleb, fueled by months of anger and injustice, was stronger. He landed a solid punch to Nash's jaw, and the foreman went limp. Caleb got to his feet, breathing heavily. He looked at Silas Blackwood, who stood alone, his empire of fear collapsing around him. The sheriff stepped forward and placed a hand on his shoulder. "Let's go, Silas." As the sheriff led the stunned, defeated man away, the saloon erupted. Men clapped Caleb on the back, shaking his hand. They looked at Abigail with a newfound awe and respect. She was no longer Blackwood's monstrous daughter. She was the woman who had brought him down. In the midst of the celebration, Caleb sought out Abigail. He found her near the doorway, watching the proceedings with a quiet, triumphant smile. He walked over to her, oblivious to the crowd. "You were magnificent," he said, his voice full of an emotion that went far beyond gratitude. "We were," she corrected him softly. He looked down at her, at the woman he had once despised. He saw her intelligence, her courage, her unwavering strength. He saw the woman who had stood by him, fought with him, and saved him. He no longer saw her size. He saw the magnitude of her heart. Slowly, deliberately, he leaned down. In the middle of the crowded saloon in front of the whole town, Caleb Thorne gently kissed his wife. It wasn't a kiss of duty or gratitude. It was a kiss of profound respect, of deep affection, and of a love that had been forged in silence, tested by fire, and finally triumphantly declared in the light. The fall of Silas Blackwood was as swift as it was complete. Faced with Marcus Webb's journal and the unified testimony of the ranchers, he'd wronged, his empire of deceit crumbled. The story of his crimes, printed in a special edition of the Redemption Gulch Clarion, became a legend in the territory. Caleb and Abigail returned to Thorn Creek, not to the prison it had once been, but to a home they had earned together. The marriage born of a cruel contract became a partnership built on a foundation of trust and mutual admiration that blossomed in the quiet days that followed into a deep and abiding love. Their story reminds us that true worth is never skin deep. It teaches us that courage can be found in the quietest corners, and that a person's greatest strength is often hidden from the world, waiting for the right moment to shine. If their journey from prejudice to partnership, from strangers to saviors moved, you show your support for stories of the untamed human spirit. Please take a moment to like this video, share it with someone who appreciates a tale of resilience, and subscribe to our channel for more true stories from the heart of the Old West. Your support helps us keep these incredible histories alive. Thank you for listening.